When it was rumoured that a Silent Hill 2 remake was in the works, in what would be a collaboration between the IP owner Konami and the third-party developer Bloober Team, there were some, to put it gently, feelings of unease from within the Silent Hill community. These feelings did not necessarily dissipate when it was officially announced either, nor did it improve with subsequent gameplay trailers. While it slightly improved when it was revealed that previous Silent Hill alumni such as Akira Yamaoka would be returning to do the score, and Masahiro Ito would be returning to do the creature designs, even then, there was still plenty of concern. To put it simply, the odds looked completely stacked against Bloober Team. It wasn't looking good. But then, something happened. They released a new trailer, and it was, without a doubt, the best one yet. And somehow, in the span of 3 minutes and 31 seconds, my attitude completely changed from a rather negative outlook on the game to one of now cautious optimism. With all this being said, 2 days before early access opens, the review embargo lifts, and the results speak for themselves. We're talking nearly overwhelmingly positive reviews from the vast majority of major news outlets, and places like the Steam review pages were also showing similar sentiments. On paper, Bloober Team actually did it, but one hurdle remained. I still had to play it myself and write my own review. So without further delay, let's talk the Silent Hill 2 remake. I played and finished the original Silent Hill 2 in July of this year in preparation for the remake, and I loved nearly every minute of it. It's a game that largely stands up to the test of time, and in many ways, it's like a fine vintage that gets better with age. How on earth do you remake such a timeless classic? Easy. You do it nearly exactly how Bloober Team has done it. A lot of this review is going to be talking about comparisons and changes to the original, and the most immediate and obvious change from the original is the fixed orbiting camera getting swapped out for the more modern third-person over-the-shoulder camera view. I found this to be a positive change overall. It brings it more in line with modern horror titles and remakes that move to this over-the-shoulder view, such as the recent Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes. The new angle practically breathed new life into these games, and I can say that without a doubt, it has done the same for the Silent Hill 2 remake. As well as this, the third-person view also allows Bloober Team to rework some of the horror aspects of the original a little bit more. Instead of going into a room and immediately seeing everything that's in it, our vision is now very limited. Crossing through a doorway becomes a terrifying gamble. It forces you to be more cautious. I kept my gun drawn and ready nearly every time I entered a new room, permanently terrified that something was waiting in the dark to get me. Speaking of the things out to get you, let's talk about the monsters. The monsters of the original Silent Hill 2 make a spectacular return and are even more dangerous than before. Each one challenges you in their own way. If you are used to the one piece of wood fits all combat of the original, it will not help you here. In great enough numbers, running is the only sound option, lest you burn through ammo and resources unnecessarily. In my opinion, the best and probably the most amusing monster that had an update is the mannequins. Instead of attacking you head on, prefer to hide in the corners or behind objects, and they stay perfectly still in an attempt to ambush you. While I found myself laughing at some of them for how obvious they were, there were still many times when they managed to give me a good scare. I'll also say that with the obvious upgrade in graphical fidelity that the remake brings, it also allows us a better look at these monsters. And in many ways, I really wish it didn't. The visual upgrades to the monsters are truly fantastic, and also make them way more unnerving to look at now that every detail is more pronounced. This is especially true of monsters such as the Abstract Daddy. Whilst the updates between the original and the remake's monsters are abundantly clear, I believe that it still stays true to the vision of the original, and it makes me think that this is what they would have looked like had graphical limitations at the time not existed. And as I mentioned earlier, Masahiro Ito, who created the original monster designs, returned for this remake and has simply updated their timeless classics for a new generation. With the monsters having been updated to be more aggressive, more intelligent, and overall much more dangerous than the previous incarnations, it's only fair that we get an entirely new combat system to fight back against them. Let's be real, the combat of the original game was not spectacular, so when I say the remake's combat is a significant improvement over the original, the bar to clear was pretty much on the floor. That being said, I really enjoyed the combat of the remake. It follows a very similar formula to the original, but implements more challenge and more of a sense of urgency. So much so that going against one bubblehead nurse with just melee weapons can prove to be quite tricky, and if monsters come at you in numbers bigger than just say 3 or 4, you may want to consider using up some of the ammo you've been hoarding for the last 4 hours. Whilst the combat of the Silent Hill 2 remake is better and arguably much more satisfying than the original, it still retains that very basic formula, and I believe the combat is this basic simply because that's who James Sunderland is. He's an everyman, not a super soldier or a roundhouse kicking special agent, he's simply just a dude. Bloober Team drives this point home with a few neat little design touches, such as how James holds the gun with his finger on the trigger. This is an obvious indication of a lack of experience when it comes to handling firearms, and also how the pistol has the chance to misfire without you even pulling the trigger, and in situations such as the fight with Eddie, the reticle shakes more so than usual, and I believe this indicates James's reluctance to take a human life. To accommodate the updated combat, the boss fights have also been reworked dramatically, the most prominent example of this being the Abstract Daddy boss fight. But originally had you confined to just one room, now has you fighting your way through a collapsing labyrinth constructed of Angela's nightmares. It's intense, it's scary, and it's so incredibly fun to play. That is how I'd sum up all of the boss fights. While I didn't find most of them to be particularly challenging on the standard difficulty, they were still well constructed and enjoyable until the very end. Much like the remake's approach to nearly everything else in the original game, the puzzles are different, and some are in a different order or location. However, they will still feel very familiar to returning players, so you may have an idea about how a puzzle works, but its function and solution are usually quite different, such as the coins in the Woodside apartments, the cube in the labyrinth, and the clock in the Blue Creek apartments. Whilst the locations and solutions may be different, the same rules still apply. This idea of logic is thrown out of the window and replaced with the kind of logic you only find in your dreams or your nightmares. Much like the original, you almost need to give in and run with this dreamlike way of thinking in order to succeed. And just like the original, Bloober Team allows the player to select the difficulty of these puzzles at the start of the game. For my first playthrough, I went for the normal difficulty and found most of the puzzles quite easy to do. This is an interesting contrast to my experience with the original game, where I struggled with the puzzle sections sometimes, to the point I had to Google the answers and consult decades-old tutorials. I don't enjoy Googling answers for a game. It's a petty belief I have that when I do that, it's a mark of a game defeating me. This apparent ease of difficulty in the remake could have something to do with the more advanced methods of signposting the remake deploys to help the player along the path. Or it could be because I'm simply more familiar with how puzzles in these kinds of horror games work now. The bottom line is this: the puzzles of the Silent Hill 2 remake are very enjoyable and wide in range. Not once did it feel boring searching my way through a level. The atmosphere, audio, and the locals made certain of that, but as well as this, I didn't have to Google anything. The environments of the original Silent Hill 2 are some of the most crushing, horrifying, and nerve-wracking I've ever had to traverse. Every inch of the game drips with fear and a feeling that your sense of reality is slowly twisting and collapsing around you. Even when limited by the technology of its time, the original designs and environments still hold up to this day. So I'll just get it out the way. The remake's environments all look genuinely stunning, whilst also being remarkably unsettling. Having been developed on Unreal Engine 5, I feel like this stellar graphical leap is the most obvious difference. However, the environments of the remake go far beyond just a simple fidelity upgrade. It feels like Bloober Team has approached this remake with a very interesting and rather brave design philosophy. Keep what we can and rework the rest. It's a pretty ballsy move, especially since in some circles, reworking even an inch of the original is considered near sacrilege. And yet, in my opinion, these reworks do not detract or make it lesser than the original at all. Instead, I firmly believe they deliver an enhanced experience. For example, as soon as you step out of that bathroom, move through the forest, and take your first steps towards the town of Silent Hill, you'll quickly realize that this is not a one-to-one remake. Two areas stood out for me in particular with this. The first is Blue Creek Apartments, which acts as our reintroduction to the Otherworld levels. This time, instead of making the environments look slightly less clean than they already were, the Otherworld levels now genuinely make you feel like you're in one of the 7 circles of hell. The second was the Labyrinth, a section I found weaker than the others in the original. In the remake, however, it has now received a significant update and has quickly made it one of my favourite parts of the entire game, as well as housing my favourite boss fight with the Abstract Daddy. Outside of a few areas that act as almost a deja vu / homage to the original, you'll find this version of Silent Hill very different to the one you may remember. Each and every area from the original has been completely reworked from the ground up, meaning that even for returning players like myself, there is an element of surprise and a returning feeling of fear of the unknown, putting these returning players back in that zone where they were first playing Silent Hill 2 all those years ago, or in my case, 6 months ago. As well as returning areas, Bloober Team injected brand new areas around Silent Hill, such as the jukebox sequence before the apartments, and also the motel after you meet Maria, and also the extended sequence at the nightclub. Even these parts that were not present in the original game slot in amongst the rest quite nicely. I really enjoyed small add-ons and changes like these, as they don't stretch out the length of the game too much, to the point that it started to feel unnecessarily bloated. Whilst the environments of Silent Hill 2 are beautiful to admire and chock full of spectacular detail, they would not be complete without some top-tier horror audio to accompany them. Audio was a remarkably important aspect of the original game's horror, and I think Bloober Team knew this as well. It's clear a remarkable amount of attention to detail went into how both audio and visual would complement each other in this game. From the ambient noises of the abandoned town, the sound of enemies shuffling around in the pitch black, the sound of disembodied voices that sound like they're right next to you, and gunshots being so incredibly loud they violently cut through the silence. And not to mention a returning Akira Yamaoka updating their original score for Silent Hill 2 more than 20 years later. It's an instance where it's near impossible to improve on what I call genuine perfection, but he somehow managed to do it. Environment and sound are 2 key ingredients to this game, and I firmly believe Bloober Team absolutely nailed it. Not only this, but in many ways, I believe they improved on the original with their updated formula. It's risky as all hell, but I believe the risk paid off in the end. The story of the Silent Hill 2 remake is one that has remained largely untouched in its overall narrative. The only parts that have been altered or updated are the order of some events that take place, and the dialogue has also been updated. This allows the remake to escape the more wooden dialogue of the original, as it allows the actors much more to work with. Speaking of, I have got to say that Luke Roberts, the new voice of James Sunderland, delivers a standout performance in one of the best instances of voice acting I've ever seen. If he isn't at least nominated for some kind of award at the Game Awards this December, there is something really wrong here. Across the entire game, he sold every single line all the way, perfectly embodying all of James Sunderland's emotions, the confusion, the fear, the repressed guilt, the bottled up rage. He did it all in a way that can only be described as genuinely award-worthy. It's the kind of performance that will stick with me for a very long time. The story itself hits as hard as ever, only this time the upgrade in fidelity allows us to invest much more in the characters. Maria's unsettling, sultry, almost marionette-like performance is creepy as all hell. Eddie's decline in mental state and his insecurities giving way to homicidal rage is intense, and Angela's horrific past with the abuse she endured at the hands of her father is tragic. When it comes to the story, Bloober Team went for what I'd consider the Goldilocks approach. What it needed to fix, it fixed, and what needed to remain, remained. It's just right. And what came of that was a fantastic updated retelling of an already fantastic story. I've chucked mountains of praise on this game throughout most of this review, but I am gonna get to a little negative here. My reviews usually don't get too technical, mostly because everything I play usually runs perfectly fine. I guess I've been lucky, up until now. This game, at launch anyway, was remarkably unoptimized. For context, these are my specs. I know for a fact that this machine should not struggle to get a consistent frame rate at medium settings at 1080p, and yet, with Silent Hill 2, it did. Performance issues were a massive hindrance to my overall enjoyment of this game, especially at the start, the biggest culprit being the traversal stutter that Unreal Engine 5 is essentially notorious for at this point. And don't think you are safe from it. You either have it or you're going to have it if you buy this game. It's a reality that you will need to accept. Whilst I will clarify that there was a patch exactly one day after I finished the game, it still failed to fix or lessen the stuttering issue, though it did fix overall performance, so I will give them that. As a side note, this stutter also exists on the PS5 version too, but from what footage I've seen, to a much less noticeable extent. While stuttering was an issue initially, I was able to get to a point where I could look past it most of the time. But what bothered me about this issue? At many points, it nearly rendered the game unplayable, and not one of the many glowing reviews it got before its launch mentioned this, and it's definitely a problem they all had, so I guess I'll mention it here then. I imagine that deciding to remake the most iconic horror game of all time certainly came with a significant amount of pressure, especially when the initial reveal was not as well received as they probably hoped it would be. But against a near tidal wave of negativity that surrounded this project for months after it was announced, Bloober Team did what many thought was impossible. They delivered a successful remake of Silent Hill 2. For me personally, there are these instances when I play a horror game where I pause and genuinely think it's too scary to proceed, where for a split second, I just consider clocking out. Don't get me wrong, I never do, but I consider that feeling the mark of a fantastic horror game. I had this feeling numerous times throughout my playthrough, where it almost felt like the suffocating, dark, and depressing atmosphere of this game was almost reaching out of my monitor towards me. To conclude, aside from the aforementioned performance issues that may or may not get patched out later, I still really enjoyed my time with the Silent Hill 2 remake. Its updated take on the story is incredible, its visuals and audio are stunning, and overall, it's as solid of a remake as we're ever going to get. The remake is a good case for Bloober Team's further involvement with the Silent Hill franchise, as I'd be curious to see how they would potentially tackle a remake of the first game or the third one. They did actually announce an entirely new horror game a few weeks ago, which looks really good, and I'm happy they're putting out their own new stuff, as I'd wager far more people are interested in it now than they were before the Silent Hill 2 remake. I just hope that this isn't the last we see of a Konami and a Bloober Team collaboration, because what they've made here is truly special.